Okay, let's talk about halos because that's what you're here for, right? I mean, that's why I'm here. We're going to talk about halos, how to avoid them, and how to fix them. Okay, now this can't be done in a single YouTube video because there's a lot of stuff that I need to discuss here. It's about variables. A lot of times you hear people tell you about, well, here's how you fix a halo. Well, I think where they fail is a lot of times they don't show you what creates a halo. They'll show you the fixing process, but often they don't show you why it's happening in the first place. So that's what we're going to do. And every time I'm about to do a live event like this, or anything for that matter, I usually talk it through with my wife. And it's not because she's a photographer or even works in the digital space. She knows nothing about this stuff. But as I talk with her through these, I usually come up with analogies that are really helpful. Now, my wife is a baker. She bakes great cakes and cookies and brownies. And at one point, she was even making sculptural cakes years ago. So I said it to her like this. I said, okay, imagine this. Imagine that you need a circle cake, okay? But the only pan that you have available is a square pan. Now you know that you can cut a circle out of that cake once it's complete and baked, right? And she's like, yeah. I said, but what's the problem with that? She said, well, the problem with that is how do you cut the perfect circle? And that's exactly what halos are like, okay? If you want a perfect circle cake, you want to start with a circle pan to begin with. You don't want to start with a square pan and then have to work with that square shaped cake to make it circular. So that's the analogy behind halos. The point being is that many times I feel like people are working against their halos because they picked the wrong pan to begin with, or they made the wrong move to begin with in their editing process. And this is inherently where I find all of the issues with halos. Now, I see halos probably more than any other photo educator on the internet. Why is that? Because on F64 Elite, I open up critique sessions every single month, and I critique 24 images. I spend I spend 5 to 7 minutes on each one of those images, and many times I see phenomenal files, beautiful locations that are destroyed by halos. And a lot of people think that there's only one type of halo, the edge halo. That's not correct. There are actually 3 types of halos that we are specifically going to be discussing in this event today. I've broken halos down into 3 categories. The first category is a ghosting halo, and a ghosting halo appears like a faded kind of circular, sometimes pattern, or it takes the shape of the object that is most dominant in the image and creates kind of this hazy effect around it. That's a ghosting halo. Probably one of the most difficult to fix, must be avoided. The second one that you're probably more familiar with is edge line halos. These are typically created because masking work is shoddy at best, okay? And a lot of times that isn't even something that you did. It's something that you are trusting to work for you, and it's creating the problem. The third type of halo that I feel is out there are micro contrast halos, and these ones are the sneakiest. These are the ones that people don't even realize they're creating a halo because it doesn't look like an edge halo and it doesn't look like a ghosting halo. These are very unique, and these typically come from sliders like clarity, texture, or over sharpening. So what we're first going to do is we're going to jump into Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to show you some raw files that have no editing done to them, and I'm going to force halos into them and then talk about how we keep that halo from happening, okay? Then what we're going to do is we're going to jump into Photoshop, and I'm going to use some of these images as examples and other images that I've already created as examples that if you must fix a halo, these are the ways that I'm going to show you to do that. I actually have 5 ways that we are going to fix halos. The first way is avoidance, okay? Most of the time, the halo is happening because you put the halo in there. I know, I'm calling you out. Well, I'm calling myself out too, okay? So that's the first one that we're going to cover is avoidance, okay? The second thing that we can do is we can clone stamp to fix a halo, typically in Edge. We can paint to fix a halo, which is something that I showed very extensively for F64 Elite members at the beginning of this month, with which prompted this live event. And making a selection of an object and making it larger, yeah, that's a form of halo correction. It's very effective. And inverse sharpening, specifically for micro contrast halos. Typically, the ones that I'm going to show you how to fix towards the end of this are going to be your edge line halos and your micro contrast halos, because those are the easiest to fix in Photoshop. Ghosting halos are best recognized while you're working on the image, period. Otherwise, they can be a nightmare to fix in Photoshop. So let's jump in, let's force some halos so we can fix them. So let's first talk about micro contrast halos. Why? Because I think these ones destroy photos, and they're the most sneaky, because people think that they're doing something that they should be doing, and in actuality they're doing something that's destroying an otherwise beautiful photo. So I'm going to start this off by just pressing the auto button, because that's typically what I do. I'm going to drop the highlights down a little bit, increase the shadows a little bit, and then I'm going to go down into the effects. Because in this macro shot, I can say to myself, I want a little bit more detail in there. So let me go to texture, because this is a highly textured image. So if I increase the texture, you'll see that as I increase the texture, it looks like you can reach in there and you can grab all of the individual little grasses that are in this macro shot. But if I increase the clarity, it's like, wow, I can really get in there and touch these details. Well, let's take a look at what's actually happening at the micro level, okay? So if we turn off these effects, look at the before. Now I'm going to unclick so you can see the after. Okay, what is happening here? We are not getting any sharper. We are not getting any more texture. And this image is not getting any more clear. What's happening here is, look at this image specifically, right along this piece right here. I'll even move this so it's more central. Look at this piece right here. I want you to specifically pay attention to the highlights and the shadows in this object right here. Okay, so I'm going to turn this effects off and turn the effects on. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer, specifically to this spot right here. I'm telling you, these micro contrast halos are going to destroy your photos. So it's really important that we dive really deep. I'll turn this off. I'll turn this on. What's happening here? What texture and clarity are doing is they're digging into the microscopic level of your image. And if I look at this, they're digging right here into the microscopic level of my highlights, my midtones, and my shadows. And what they're typically doing is they're making highlights more bright and shadows more dark. And sometimes they can actually create this white kind of haloing edge around objects. Now that one kind of looks a little bit more green, but if I turn this off, turn this on, you see that little halo right there? That is a teeny tiny microscopic halo. And it's going to be happening over everything in our image. And it's going to look even worse in these areas right here, where these should be in an area of bokeh or bokeh, depending on how you pronounce it. That's what that should look like. It should not look like this. So this is forcing a microscopic, micro contrast halo into your image. How do we fix it? At the raw level, we do not want to be doing texture and clarity, okay? I very rarely touch any of these effects. As a matter of fact, if I wasn't an educator and I wasn't going to receive 100 comments on it almost every week when I put out an ACR video, I would probably right click in here, say edit panels to show, and just turn off the effects. I never use them. I never feel a need to use them because I feel at the raw level they do more harm than good. You could say, well, Blake, you really cranked those up, didn't you? Okay, let me go over here into effects. You really cranked those up when you went to texture and clarity. But what I want you to see is that once you get past 20, which some people think is a safe realm to stay in, once you get past plus 20, it really doesn't do that much different. So if you're going to use these, I would say maybe +2 to +10 max on your texture and your clarity, because once you get past +20, it's not that easy to see anymore that it's really doing much of anything. It's just taking that micro contrast halo and making it worse. Now, this is a macro image. Most of you feel this doesn't apply. Let's take a look at something like a landscape like this. And you might wonder why I'm not talking about portraits. Well, one of the reasons why I'm not talking about portraits in any of this is because portraits, typically, we don't take them nearly as far as we take our landscape and architecture images. Why is that? I don't necessarily know, but I would imagine this. Think of a portrait. It's a delicate thing. So while we're working on it, we typically are a little bit more delicate with our sliders. I would liken it to someone who builds with steel and glass, where the predominant structure that they're creating is going to be glass. They're going to be extremely careful while they're building that structure. Okay, because if you don't, it will easily break down, especially when you're working on a portrait, breaks down those beautiful skin tones, and it just doesn't look good when we take things to the landscape realm. Landscapes, on the other hand, are kind of like someone who builds with wood. It's very forgiving. Okay, glass is not forgiving at all. You make the wrong cut, you could snap the glass and break it. Okay, and then you're out. With wood, you make the wrong cut, not that big of a deal. You can usually either fill it in with another piece of wood, or you can modify accordingly. And if you're savvy enough with that, it'll work out. I think when we're working with landscapes, they're a little bit more forgiving, whereas portraits aren't. So let's take a look at what happens when we do that for an image like this. I'll turn this to auto, and then I'm going to bring the texture up and the clarity up. And you might think to yourself, who would do things like this? But the thing is, folks, I see this all the time. This is even a Sony A1 file. You would think with all that detail, why would you need to go in there and increase your texture and your clarity? Well, the more important question is, if you don't have a Sony A1 that doesn't show you that detail, this is where you'll think you're going to need to go to get it. And it's just not the best place to do it. Because again, if we zoom in here and we look at what's happening here, we are creating really small micro halos around every piece of detail in the image. What happens here, especially in a landscape like this is an image that's actually relatively difficult to edit because we have a lot of texture. We have texture from the trees. We have texture from the rocks. We have texture from the waterfall. We have texture from all this junk that fell off of this cliff, and I feel really bad for those trees. That must have hurt. We have texture everywhere. So if you're going to increase the texture because you want to get more detail, essentially what you're doing is it's making it more difficult for the viewer to engage with your piece. So with this increase in texture and this increase in clarity, do we see more in this image? Yes, we do, but we shouldn't take it up this high. I will show you in Photoshop when we go to fix this micro contrast how to do it effectively so that you can still get that detail that you want in some places, but not have it in other places. So now let's go ahead and move on to edge halos. Edge halos come typically when you're working with your image and you're trying to separate two objects and you're adjusting the contrast individually of those objects. This is pretty much where it always happens and it always affects you negatively. It might not be as evident in this image, but it's clearly going to be evident in the next image. In this image here, let's just go ahead and press auto. Let's go ahead and drop our highlights and increase our shadows. Now, when we do this, we can see that this image doesn't look that great to us. And typically, it's probably because we have some type of white balance problem. So I'm going to press and hold the Shift key and click on this object here. And it's like, wow, I really enjoy what's happening with that mountain there, but I don't like what's happening with the sky. I really want this to be more yellow, but I want that to be more blue. So what I'm going to do is press Alt or Option and reset the color on here. Anytime you say something like that to yourself, it typically means that you need to mask. So what that means is I'm going to need to make a mask for my sky and a mask for my foreground. So I'm going to go into the masking section and I'm going to make a sky mask. That will separate the sky from the foreground. All right. So once it makes this mask, I'm going to click on these three dots here and say duplicate and invert mask. So now I have the foreground and now I have the background. So now that these are separate, let's say here, I want to make this a little bit more yellow. Now you'll see what I'm talking about here. Look at that. That looks great. So we're getting more yellow in this foreground, but keeping the blue in the background. So now if I increase the exposure a little bit here, since I have them separated, I can do this. I'll drop the highlights and increase the shadows and maybe give myself a little bit more contrast in this space here. Okay. That's getting pretty good. All right. But now I'll go up to my sky because I want to edit that individually. So in my sky, let's make that a little bit darker. Okay. And you're probably starting to see it happen right now. As we make that darker, let's maybe drop our highlights and increase our shadows here a little bit. Okay. That typical contrast adjustment, maybe even make it more contrasty. And here's where it happens. Boom. Okay. So some might say, I love that sky. It's so dramatic and powerful. This has also introduced a halo. I don't necessarily like what I've done with this image, but there are some that may, because they see that sky and they think, oh, that sky was so beautiful and rich that night. I need it to look contrasty like this. And then the foreground is least or less contrasty than the background. So now we're starting to see where this edge halo is coming in. I can zoom in right here on this space right here, and you start to see this little teeny tiny little line of an edge halo. It's not that bad in this one, but that should be not necessarily something that you want to fix. This should trigger you to say, oh, red flag, avoid. I've done something here that is destroying my photograph. You'll understand that if you just avoid the halos to begin with and know that these halos are actually a warning sign to tell you you've taken this too far. This is it right here. Now, I had a conversation with Matt Kliskowski about this the other day on the phone. He asked me what I was doing this week, and I said, I'm building this live event about halos. And he goes, what are you going to say? And I was like, well, I'm going to say you should avoid them to begin with. And he goes, exactly. That's what I tell people all the time. He's like, I probably have 10 or 15 videos that tell people if you have a halo, you've done something wrong. And boom, there you have it. Two people that are on the same playing field when it comes to halos. The last ditch effort should be fixing it. The first thing you should think of is, why is this happening and what is the image trying to tell me because I see this halo? So what this is trying to tell us is that the background sky should actually be brighter. As soon as I make that background sky brighter, A, the image looks better to begin with, and B, the halo is gone. Why is that? That's because I'm making the contrast in the background brighter instead of trying to make it darker. Now, I will also say this because I don't like them very much. The masking that is in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom is not that great. I can see that 9 times out of 10, if I separate the background from the foreground or the sky from the subject, 9 times out of 10, an edge halo is incurred in there. And it's rather difficult actually to fix these masks once they've been created. It's much easier to do that inside of Photoshop. So if you're trying to take your image too far in Adobe Camera Raw, I would say that's most of the time where you're going to find your halos is at the raw level. At least that's where I see them in my own workflow. All right, so now we've got the sky has, it's brighter, okay? So we're gonna drop the highlights here because those brights are really bright. And then actually that's our foreground. Let me go to our sky here. I'll click on the sky. And then I'll go ahead and drop those whites because they're pretty bright. And you see when I drop those brights, I can actually take up my exposure slider a little bit more, okay? And it still looks good. And I can give this even a little bit more blue, okay? Now, if I go down to the foreground area here, okay, in the foreground, I'm gonna make that even more yellow. I'm going to increase the exposure a little bit, increase the contrast a little bit because I want that to be the thing that people see more. Maybe actually even increase the highlights in those so that it's a little bit brighter in some of those spaces. Now, this is actually more likely what this should look like, okay? So here's your before, here's your after. We've built a good, solid baseline image that is free of the halo. Again, the key factor here is I created the halo because of something that I did incorrectly. It's really important. We have to take ownership of that. You cannot blame it on the software, okay? Because the software is going to let you do whatever you want it to do, but it's up to us to make sure we're doing the right thing. Now I'm going to show you a ghosting halo and an edge halo in the same image. Typically, where I see the most issues with halos is in images where you're really pushing the boundaries. Take a look at this one. This is pretty much the -2 exposure value for an HDR processed image that I did from Ruby Beach on the Washington coast. And I'm doing this on purpose because let's say you shoot the shot, you don't have your +2 or your 0 exposure, you only have the -2 exposure. What can we do? Is this salvageable? Well, the answer is yes, it is salvageable. But the problem with this is that we're going to possibly incur 2 different types of halos in the process of creating this image. So if I press the auto button here, I'm going to just change my profile here to my camera neutral profile. So I find that that's a little bit more helpful. So I'll go to camera matching and I'm going to find a neutral profile here. I tend to like that a little bit more than Adobe's profiles. But now we drop the highlights and we increase the shadows. Okay, look right here. This area around this C stack right here is what I'm talking about with a ghosting halo. And this ghosting halo just looks like a little bit of a blurred edge that's a little bit lighter than the contrast that's around it. Okay, these ghosting halos, like I said, are very tricky to fix in post-production. because the thinner the edge halo, the easier it is to fix, to be honest with you. But when you get this ghosting halo, you really have to pay attention to what's happening with the imagery here in order for this to work. So I'll increase my exposure a little bit, and that's going to help it. But guess what? We are still going to see that haloing edge. So this is where finesse with the sliders is important, to know that I can't take those shadows up to 100%, and I can't take those highlights down 100%, because that is creating that ghosting halo. Okay, so now we're in that position where we've fixed the ghosting halo. We've avoided it, I should say. But I still want more brightness in the foreground and more contrast in the background. Well, what do we have to do? We have to go into our masking section, and we have to mask the sky to make the sky selection, and then we have to inverse this and duplicate it to make the foreground section. So now if I'm looking at the sky, and let's do the foreground first, okay? I'm gonna just increase this exposure a little bit here, maybe reduce those highlights and increase those shadows a little bit here, okay? Maybe I'll even bring that down a little bit. Now I'll go over to the mask, and let's say I want this to be more contrasty, so I start to bring this down. Look around the edge of this image. You're starting to see those halos come in, okay? Those edge halos are coming in right along the edge of our C stacks here. So if I were to zoom in here, you start to see a haloing edge around here. One could say, well, we've already got these separated. Why do what we did in the original raw file steps over here? Let's just go ahead and Alt or Option and reset this and see if in masking we can do more with this foreground. And this is where you're probably going to see an even worse edge halo. If I increase the exposure here, I'm working on the foreground. If I increase this exposure to brighten that up, okay, here is where you are going to see that really bad edge halo. I'll zoom in right here like this. And some people will say, well, I would never take this image that far. Well, you'd be surprised. I see all kinds, okay? So now we'll increase the brightness here, and we're still seeing an edge halo happening right here on this C stack. That is an edge halo. And that, again, should warn you that you're taking things too far. So what does that mean in this instance? That means that there's a balance that needs to be had here. I'm going to go ahead and reset these sliders, and I'm going to go ahead and reset these sliders. Just reset everything to default, okay? Now that's going to change my crop too. How about I reset it to open so that my crop is better? There we go. I don't want to have to fix that for you. This is where we have to make a balance, where if we're going to try and separate the background and the foreground and still have good contrast between the two that we can hand off into Photoshop, we have to be cognizant of what we're doing the whole step of the way. So I'm going to increase my exposure here a little bit, maybe increase those shadows a little bit here, because that's really going to be for this foreground. And in this way, I have to work on this file differently, because I may not even come in here and touch things like the highlights, because I'm starting to see that edge halo, okay? So maybe at the global level, I just bring that down just a little bit. And in the whites, I bring those down a little bit since they're pretty strong back there. Now I'm going to hop over, because this gives me almost what would be like a zero exposure value, if I could even get a zero exposure value in the extreme conditions that I had in this image. And by no means is this an award-winning image. It's just a good example to use on how we balance for these edge halos. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to make a sky selection, and then I'm going to duplicate and invert this mask. Okay. So now in the background, okay, I'm on the background here first. Make that a little bit darker. Okay. Maybe make that a little bit more on the yellow side because it's nice and bright, and then maybe a little bit of magenta in there to get that sunset kind of look going. Now I'll go to my foreground, and I'll increase the exposure just a little bit, okay? And then maybe drop my highlights, and then increase those shadows a little bit, okay? And then I'll maybe give that a little bit more as well, and maybe get it away from that green by giving it a little bit more of that magenta. This would be a good baseline to start from. This would be the baseline of an image that I would bring into Photoshop to do the rest of my work on, because I know that it's evened out, okay? I don't have too extreme of highlights, too extreme of shadows, and I can work with this image in Photoshop because I know that most of the things that I've done here have started to incur halos. Now, one thing that we do have to watch out for is if I zoom in here, right on the edge here of this, I'll zoom in right here. okay, is that what you're seeing on this side, that is not necessarily an edge halo. That could possibly be a chromatic aberration. So let me go over to my optics section, and then I'll make sure that I remove chromatic aberration, okay? And then I increase my purple amount and increase my green amount so that I get that fixed. These aren't necessarily halos. They're just more of a nuisance because they create like a colored edge halo. And here would be the before, and here's the after. It's a slight cleanup on that red edge that we have there. Now, we don't actually see too much of a chromatic aberration that is on the edges of this image because the lens is a pretty good lens. But if you do see like a colored line around your subjects, that is a chromatic aberration, not necessarily a halo, but it can be just as devastating as a halo, especially the further you get into your editing and the more color work you do, the more evident they become. So this is the first part. The first part about this was all about avoidance. Now remember, we have 3 types of halos. We have micro contrast halos, or halos around details. We have ghosting halos, which is that kind of feathered look that comes out from an edge that almost looks like a gradient. And then we have our edge halos. Of all of them that are fixable, micro contrast halos and edge halos, I feel, are the easiest to fix. The first fix we have for that is avoidance. The next 4 fixes we have for that are going to be in Photoshop. So now we're in Photoshop because we're going to fix them. Most people just want to fix them. They don't want to hear, Blake, you told me to avoid them. I don't make halos. Here's the deal. If you avoid them, you never have to fix them. But in the event that you do have an image that you're working on and it has a halo and you must fix it, I'm going to give you 4 ways. Remember, the first way was just to avoid them altogether. So we're going to talk about the micro contrast halo right now. This is the image that I forced a lot of micro contrast into. If we look at this sky, or sorry, the background here, in this background we see a really big mess of texture because we have texture on top of texture, on top of texture, on top of texture. And this is a nightmare. When you're post-processing, you will never really get the viewer to see what you want them to see with this much micro contrast in the image. It's going to be a barrier right from the very beginning of what you even want to create. Because what we're trying to do is create a 3-dimensional space from a 2-dimensional object. And when you put this much contrast in the image, you are making it flat. And to reverse it is almost impossible, but it's possible. If you're in my critique sessions, I usually tell people, hey, if you've got this much micro contrast, go back into your raw file. If you use texture and clarity, knock it out, and you're going to want to locally sharpen and not globally use texture and clarity. In the event that we have the image in Photoshop and you really want the contrast, let's say you really want that micro contrast in this area here, but you don't necessarily want it everywhere else. The way I would do this is with a high pass. Yes, high pass. You're thinking, Blake, you're going to sharpen this more? No. What a high pass is you can use high pass for sharpening, but if you invert the high pass information, you can actually use it for blurring, and more importantly, for blurring micro contrast details. This isn't necessarily going to be like a Gaussian blur, because that would just make the whole image really blurry. We need to do a micro contrast blur. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this background layer, and I'm going to invert it right off the bat, and it's going to look ugly. If you're an F64 Elite member, I have a course called The Inverted Image where I show so many techniques that teaches you how there is data in the inverse that is so important. It's kind of like Stranger Things, that TV show, the upside down. There is information in the upside down that can help you with the right side up. Okay, so now the blend mode I want to set this to is linear light, and I'm typically going to start this fill at about 50%. So what you're going to see here is a gray image, and you're like, what is going on? Why is this gray? Well, essentially, we have taken the inverse data. We've used linear light, which is a contrast blend mode, and we've made a 50-50 blend of both, which is going to take the inverse data with the normal data and basically just completely neutralize everything. But when we take this and go to filter and go to other and go to high pass, you're going to see that we're not sharpening right now. If I zoom in here into this background area at a high pass of 2.1 pixels, look at what we're doing here. We are actually blurring this, okay? But we're blurring it at the micro contrast level. So the reason why I set this up to begin with as it already being inverted was that so when I was in this high pass section with my linear light and my 50% fill already set up, I could just slowly start to bring this up and see how it's blurring that stuff in the background that shouldn't have that contrast to begin with. Now, I will say that this is mildly destructive, okay, because it's not happening at the raw level. Again, this is one of those things that if you have to use it in Photoshop, use it in Photoshop, but use it locally, not globally like this. So let's say we want this to be in this foreground area. We want this to have that kind of tack sharp detail to it, okay? Because that's what we brought in from Adobe Camera Raw. What I would do is I would put a mask on here. I'm just gonna press Alt or Option while I click on that mask, which will make it black. And then I can brush with my brush that's white and start blocking out the things that I don't want to get that much micro contrast. Or another way of thinking it is add the areas in that I want to take the contrast away from. So I'm going to brush along these trees with white, and I'll brush along the background here with white. And you'll notice as I start brushing along the trees in the background, it almost makes them feel as if they're disappearing into the distance, doesn't it? Because that's what's supposed to happen. That's how we photograph things. That's how things look to our eye, okay? A lot of times people just want the nines, man. They want to crank to the nines. Just give me all of it. I want all of it. No, 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 no. You have to work more delicately with your images. Okay, so now that the percentage is at 50%, if I want less and I want to bring back more of that, I can move this to the left. It's almost like my own slider for details now. Bring it to the right, it's going to make that even more blurry, okay? So if I zoom in here on this background, it's not going to look good if it's above 50%. I will pretty much tell you that. So 50% is going to be your baseline to make sure that it's okay. You can pretty much go lower than that, but if you go any higher than that, you're going to see some artifacting up here. And you see it? It almost looks like we're trying to now blur sharpen or blarpen. I've never heard of blarpening before. So let's just go ahead and put that below 50 and we're pretty good. I think I might have made a new word, blarpening. I might have to use that one of my critiques. If you're not an F64 Elite member, you might want to become one so you can hear it later. All right, so that looks good. So what we've done there is we've basically selectively sharpened the things that we want to have that. Again, most people won't think that that's considered a halo, but I consider it a halo because it's creating micro contrast halos around all of your micro contrast detail. Now let's get into the things that are more common. In this image here, this image is an image from my portfolio that typically does not have a halo in it. I actually forced a halo into this so that we could see it. And I'm going to move in here and you're going to see this micro, very small little halo that goes around all the edge work of this image. So what this is basically making a selection for the sky and for the foreground independently and not necessarily fixing them before going into Photoshop. Like if I'm at Adobe Camera Raw and I tell the sky to be too contrasty and we know that the masks in there are not nearly as good as the masks in Photoshop, then we want to separate that here in Photoshop. Okay, you get the point. There's a halo around the whole thing. So how do we fix this? You know, there's another method I'm going to show you that uses the clone stamp tool and one that uses the brush. At this point, we've talked about avoidance, which is our first one, the inverse sharpen or blarpen. And now we're going to talk about basically making a selection and making it bigger and just expanding it. So one of the tools that I absolutely love inside of Photoshop recently, it's in 2024 and 2025, is this object selection tool. Now what I'm going to do with this object selection tool is I'm just going to draw all the way around my mountain area here. Okay, this will show you just how much smarter Photoshop is than Adobe Camera Raw. Okay, so now as I draw that around there and I zoom in here, I'm going to zoom in really micro. Look at what it selected. It was pretty smart in that it knew that, hey, this edge is not necessarily what we want. Now I might have to clean this up by adding things and subtracting things. So if I press and hold the Shift key, I can add to this selection, okay? If I press and hold the Alt key, I can subtract from this selection. I need to add this here, okay? I need to add this here, okay? And then I'll just go around, press and hold Shift and add the things that I need to add to this selection. And if there's anything that I need to subtract from it, I can do that as well. But right now I'm getting things that aren't necessarily the halo, okay? And then this, it got confused. It thinks that that's part of the edge, but it's not. Again, press and hold Shift. I'll go right over to this and make sure that I'm avoiding anything that could be a halo there. Again, press and hold shift along this snowy edge. It thinks that that snowy edge shouldn't be included. So I'm just adding that stuff to it. A lot of times people think, oh, I'll just make an object selection and they'll just get right at it. No. Now, you see here, we have the halo in here. So I'll press Alt or Option, and that will subtract from the selection. I don't need to necessarily make this perfect, but it's got to be believable. Okay. Subtract that, Alt or Option, subtract more of this. Okay. And then Shift to get this into place here. Okay. Now I'll make this bigger. I was about right here when I did that. I'm not going to go through the rest of this and do all that because that would just be painstakingly annoying for me if I was watching this in a live event. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this. Just assume that I went through the whole thing and fixed it. I just don't want to do it for everything right now. I'm going to press Command or Control J to duplicate that. Now that is duplicating what's happening in this foreground area. So I'm going to press Command or Control T. And all I'm going to do here is zoom in right here to where I see that halo, and then press and hold Shift as I move this up. Okay, and look at that. As I move it up, I'm pressing and holding Shift so that it doesn't expand out like this. It just goes straight up. Essentially, all I did was take the subject and move it about 3 pixels. Basically, just move it slightly above where that haloing edge was. And look at that. We have no haloing edge. Now, did I move the bottom? No, because I didn't just move it up. I pressed and held the Shift key so it would enlarge it from the top, leaving the bottom exactly where it is and the sides exactly where they are. It may change the perspective a little bit, but that's okay because it's not that big of a deal. Before, after. Do you see a huge difference? No, because the movement was so small. This is one that you don't see a lot of people really showing. But I think it's a very effective tool, especially when you have a background that has kind of a lot going on to it and a foreground that is very easy to select. But let's say you're in a position like this image right here. I photographed this image in Punta Cana with my wife when we were out on our 15-year anniversary. Really cool little lizard that was just hanging out. I had a horrible profile selected on my camera, and for some reason, it wouldn't even fix it at Adobe Camera Raw. I actually had to open it in Camera Raw so it would read through that, and then I fixed the image accordingly. But I really like this image. But one of the biggest problems with this image as I started to go through it, I'm going to zoom in here and show you this, is it's slightly out of focus. And it's not necessarily out of focus. What was happening was it was relatively windy. And as I was taking the picture, it seemed like it was in focus, but a slight wind blew this flower and I missed the shot. But there was no other shot in the series that looked like that. So I really wanted to save this. Okay, so what I did was I used Topaz Gigapixel. And what Gigapixel does is it's phenomenal at retaining detail, especially when you have something that's just slightly out of focus. Now, I didn't duplicate or enlarge this or make it bigger with Topaz. What I did was I just wanted the detail, all this little detail that we see in our lizard. Now, what happens with that detail? It's essentially an AI version of micro contrast increase to get that detail. Well, look at the outline of our lizard. We have this horrible halo that's been incurred here, and that's been incurred throughout my entire editing process of this image. But how do we make something like this salvageable, an image that we really truly are attached to and want to make it salvageable? Is there a way to fix that halo so we can move on and make some artwork out of this? Yes, there is. There are 2 methods that I'm going to show you here. One is using the clone stamp tool, and the other one uses a brush. And I use these independently depending on how I think or what I'm going to need. Most people like to use the clone stamp tool set to something like darker color or lighter color depending on if that halo is lighter or darker than the object around it. But I find that you can also get the same success using a brush and sampling it if the background is a flat wash of color. So these are your last 2 ways of fixing halos. And these are actually the more common ways of fixing halos. So I wanted to show these ones last because these are typically when you search for how to fix a halo, you're going to find hundreds of YouTube videos that point to this, but not many that talk about enlarging the subject or talk about micro contrast halos, because people just assume that's a sharpening thing, but a sharpening thing is incurring halos. Okay, so how do we fix this? Well, first off, I'm going to need to make a new layer on top of this, this whole set of things that I've got going on here. And what I'm going to do is some people will actually set the tool to darken or lighten. I like to set the layer itself that I'm working on. So because I'm working on its own layer, I'm actually going to call this halo reduction, so I know what it is. Okay. When I call that halo reduction, I'm going to call this halo reduction darker because there might be a halo reduction lighter. So let me just go ahead and duplicate this by pressing Command or Control J, and then I'll call this lighter. Okay, so there's two blend modes that we can use that are going to help us out here. And there are some areas in this image where I'm going to need to use lighter color and not darker color. This is also one of those reasons why I like to work in this way with brushes rather than the clone stamp tool. Many people will correct me and say, no, you don't need to do that. Just use a clone stamp tool. And yes, that is an option, but there are many options out there, and you might find that one works better for you. The first one I'm going to show is using brushes. Then I'll show it using the clone stamp because the clone stamp is slightly easier than brushes. So with this halo reduction darker, I want to set the blend mode to darker color. So this is darker color right here. Halo reduction lighter, I'm going to set this to lighter color, which is going to be right here. Okay. So what this is basically saying is that if the color is lighter or darker than the color that I have selected, it will fill it in accordingly. So I'm on darker color here. And this is the halo I want to fix around the edge of my guy right here. And I have actually fixed those already in these layers here. So I'm going to turn those off so you can see them a little bit better. So here's where you're going to see a darker halo, and here's where you're going to see a lighter halo. Typically, what we'll find when we are editing our images is that we are typically going to see lighter halos. But once AI gets involved, funky things can happen, and you might see dark halos around things, okay? So halo reduction darker. I need to select a color that is going to be darker than the color that we have on the back edge of my lizard here. So I'm going to press the B for my brush tool. I'm going to right click here and just use a soft round brush that is very small. Basically about the size, maybe a little bit bigger than the actual halo that I have. So 6 pixels works here. I have this set to darker color. So I'm going to press Alt or Option, and I'm going to click on the color that is just outside this halo, which is right there. Now as I brush along this edge, you'll see that because this color that I've selected is darker than that halo, but lighter than the skin of the lizard, this works. Typically, this will work a lot. I'm going to press Alt or Option and sample a little bit more and just brush along this edge here. Okay, that looks good. Now, what's happening up here? You see this little halo right here? I see it. That's actually a dark halo. So let me go to lighter color. And here, I'm going to press Alt or Option and click on the color that's outside of that darker halo. Maybe make my brush a little bit bigger and then just brush this right along this edge. Okay, now I don't want to go into my lizard on this one. That one I have to be very careful that I just go right along this edge of the lizard here to get rid of that darker colored halo using a lighter color set brush. And in fixing this, I would go around the whole image and do this. Again, go to the darker color, Alt or Option, click right here, and just move it along the edge, and that will help get that. Now you're going to see sometimes there's a differentiation between the colors that I'm selecting. At that point, I'll just have to press Alt or Option and then just brush along that edge after I've sampled another color here, okay? And I would do this all the way along the edge of this little guy here until that entire halo is gone. Okay, so that is using darker color. Let's zoom in here because look at this. Some funky stuff happened right here along this. And we have some haloing that's on the inside of the object and not on the outside. This is where things get really crazy, but you can fix this also. So on this halo lighter color, I'm going to press Alt or Option and click on this color that is just outside of this, make my brush a little bit bigger and just brush along on the inside of here. And I can fix this funky, weird, darker color that got into this space when I was using AI. And again, AI can be our friends. It can also be our enemy. And I'm just brushing very delicately around here. If I need to make my brush smaller, I will. Am I going to work at this microscopic level to fix these? Absolutely, I'm going to, because it is absolute necessity. And then I'll make this a little bit bigger, Alt or Option, and then brush right here along this one. Again, because we are still set to making the darker color that is here go away because we're using a lighter color on the brush. Okay, perfect. Now, in this instance here, look at this edge here. How am I going to handle that one? Could I use this green? I could, or I could click on the darker color, Alt or Option, click on like a form of yellow that's in here, make that brush really small, and then just brush right along the edge. It really helps if you've got a Wacom tablet or a tablet of some sort. Just brush right along this edge. If I make a mistake, I just keep my hand near Control Z, So I can Control Z on out of there. Okay, undo it. Just undo it if you need to. And I would really just go back and forth between lighter color and darker color and clean this up, and you can make some samples along the way while you do that and paint that in. And that can help. When it's at that micro level, that really small level, it's really kind of hard to see it anyway. So if you make an error, don't beat yourself up too much. It would really take somebody digging real deep to see that. It's kind of like noise reduction. So that is the lighter color and darker color using a brush. We can also do lighter and darker color using a clone stamp tool. Some people find this to be easier. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a new layer and call this Halo, and we'll make that darker. Okay. And on my clone stamp tool, what I need to do on the clone stamp tool is I'm going to change this to a soft round brush again. And then in the clone stamp tool, I need to make sure that it is affecting the current layer that we have here and the layers below. Not all layers, because if you end up doing this somewhere in the middle of your workflow and you have it set to all layers, it's going to sample what's on top, what's on bottom, and what's everywhere else. So if this layer is somewhere sandwiched in between, you're not going to want that. You want current and below. So now I'll make this brush smaller, or this clone stamp smaller, I should say. And I'll right click. I guess I got to do it that way because it's not making my brush smaller with my brackets. So I'll make that a little bit smaller. Okay, to about 12 pixels. I think I had that a little bit smaller at about 6 or 8. So now it's working. All right, so now what I need to do is with the clone stamp tool, you just need to press Alt or Option and click just outside of where that is and then brush. Now, because this is sampling at all times, you'll see that that little cursor is following me. What is that doing? Actually, this is set to normal. Let me change that to darker color. Okay. So what this is doing as we brush along this edge is it is sampling the nearest color as I brush along. So this is why a lot of people like this, because it's not like the brush where you have to resample often. You just brush, and as you brush, it's making the sample from what's around it. I do like this method. It's very helpful. But I will say that it's not always going to be the 100% best go-to method for fixing a halo. But it does work out very well. Okay, so as we brush this along, you see that we are just sampling constantly from the areas that are around it, and the whole edge of that is gone. It works much faster, I will say, than something like the brush. But in some environments where, let's say you have something like this, if you're sampling and there's some texture, it will sample that exact texture and place it in that halo, which could create repeated patterns if your brush is too big. Or if the area that you're saying should be darker is this, and then you have this lighter area, it's going to make that darker with that sampling as well. So sometimes that is the best option, and other times you'll find that the brush is the best option. So let's do some recap and review here so we can wrap this up. First things first, if you have a halo, it should be a warning sign. You should be having warning signs go off. Imagine it's like a movie where everyone's just going about their business and then, oh my gosh, we got to do something. All right. That's what happens when you see a halo. It should trigger your spider sense to tingle and say, I need to fix this. The halos that should be warning you are what types of halos? Micro contrast halos, the super sneaky ones when you're making things too sharp or too detailed. What else? You have the ghost halos that look like a gradient or like a radiating glow around objects. Very difficult to fix in Photoshop. Notice how I didn't even really go into that in Photoshop because it is a nightmare to fix those. I could probably do a whole event just on trying to fix those, but I won't, because you shouldn't get them if those warning signs go off. Avoidance is the key for ghosting halos. Then we have edge halos. Edge halos are probably the most common and the ones that you're going to see most often. Again, avoidance because of shoddy masking is typically where you're going to see that. If you must fix them inside of Photoshop. The first method for fixing those halos is going to be the enlarge option, where you just grab the object and make it bigger and you cover up the halo. It's a crazy easy way to do it. But what you'll know, in the image of the lizard, we couldn't quite do that. In that event, you're going to have to use either the brush technique set to lighter or darker color, depending on the color of the halo, or you're going to have to use lighter or darker with the clone stamp. And what about those micro contrast halos? Remember, the blarpen, the blur sharpen. That's exactly how you fix those inside of Photoshop. And that's a high pass, inverted, and using the sliders there as your blur amount that you want for the details that have been over sharpened or over detailed. As I mentioned already, F64 Elite members got an extensive look, about a 20-minute look at the brush concept and that lizard image a little bit more closely in this month's Photoshop tip. This live event will be available for F64 Elite members indefinitely. It's always going to be in the live event archive. If you're not an F64 Elite member, this live event is only going to be available until Tuesday at midnight. Tuesday the 27th at midnight. At that time, you will not be able to watch this anymore, and you should just become an F64 Elite member because there's a ton of content over there anyway that you're really going to love and enjoy. Now I'm going to open it up for questions. If you have any questions about these techniques, any questions about halos and avoidance, please feel free to ask those questions now. If you want to add to the subject, you're more than welcome to do that as well. There are many ways that we can fix halos. These, for me, are the surefire methods. So let's get into the Q&A. Actually, before that, there's an offer that's just been pinned to the top of the chat. This is going to be for F64 Elite. If you're wondering what the coupon codes are, they're going to be on the page. And in about 2 minutes, you're going to get an email that's going to take you to the replay page for this live event. The Q&A isn't going to be there yet, but the video will be there. And then underneath that video, you're going to see an opportunity to become an Elite member. Because again, this live event will only be available for non-Elite members until May 27th at midnight. For Elite members, it's available indefinitely, like all the other live events that I've done since 2016. So there's 8 years worth of live events on F64 Elite, along with 8 years of critique sessions, along with 8 years of courses. There's a ton of content in there. So let's go into the comments. Actually, let's go into the questions. Ulrich says, as it is such a problem, I'm wondering why there is no real AI tool for fixing this problem, but well, the Adobe creatives have a lot more to worry about. They do have a lot to worry about. I would say that this isn't good for an AI tool because if you've ever generated any AI images in any AI generation period, they all have micro contrast halos, every single one of them. Why? Because I think they want you to make them look more fantastic than they are. Anytime I generate an AI image, it doesn't matter if it's from Midjourney, Magnific, Adobe, the first thing I do is basically run a blarpen action on it. I blur sharpen it. I inverse sharpen it to get rid of the micro contrast. So because AI makes such micro contrast issues in the generation process, at this time, I don't think AI would be good at finding what those halos are. So I don't think that AI would be a good thing for that yet. But here we are in 2025. You can make me eat crow in 2027 when it's there. Let's see. Could you mask the object with halo and expand or reduce by a few pixels to restrict the overpainting in areas you don't need to fix? You could, but typically the overpainting won't be an issue if the color on the opposite side is a darker color than the other color on the object. But yes, you could also add an object selection mask in there and just go over the outside edge by inverting that mask. You could do that as well. But everything when it comes to halos, you have to understand is like not every one of them is going to be cookie cutter. Okay, it's not like sometimes you might need to use 2, maybe even 3 methods. You might need to, it depends on the halo and it really depends on the image. I tried to make as many possible examples as I could that I found, that I find in my critique sessions. How does one avoid ghost halos? Typically, Barbara, a ghost halo you avoid by not taking the sliders to that point. In this live event, in that image specifically, I talked about a balancing act. There's a balancing act. It's kind of like pool pH. I'm going through that right now. Like the chemicals in my pool. If I want to increase the alkalinity, that's also going to decrease my pH. So what do I need to do? I then need to add a chemical that's going to increase the pH because I'm decreasing it with the alkalinity increase. So it's very much the same when it comes to this. If the slider that you're pushing is causing the ghosting halo, stop pushing it. Go to another slider or go to another section and see if when you separate the masks, you don't incur that halo. Typically, global adjustments are going to be the worst for those ghosting halos. I find that in Photoshop all the time because Photoshop kind of gets confused. I think what it's, or not Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw, Lightroom. I think what it's doing is it's kind of making a contrast map of your image. So when you move those sliders and you see that kind of halo happening around the edge, it's almost like there's some type of I don't know how they do what they do, but they do some wizardry behind those sliders. But that's why I feel like global adjustments create those halos, those ghosting halos over doing masking to do like your background and your foreground. So I would consider that if you're seeing a ghosting halo, stop pushing the sliders, pull them back before the ghost happens, and then go into another area. But typically, I don't see ghosting halos inside of Photoshop. I typically only see those ghosting halos when I'm working on the image globally. So hopefully that helps. Do you notice halos more if a low f-stop was used? Not really. Typically, where I see halos more is actually, pause. I do see them with a low f-stop, but it's usually introduced by somebody who is trying to sharpen bokeh. And that is kind of like the macro image that we saw. When you're using the texture and the clarity on images that should have some bokeh in them, or bokeh, however you want to pronounce it, if you see that, then yes, it could be a lower f-stop issue, typically on macro images or even portrait images. Our background should not be sharpened if there's bokeh in it. Sorry, period. Okay, if you are sharpening, globally sharpening an image that you shot at f2.8 or f4, that is just wrong all day long. Okay, so that was cool. I might have to use that again. The idea there is do not globally sharpen anything, period, that has an f-stop of 1.2 to 4.0. That is just a bad idea. Because it will create those micro contrast halos, and they'll be much more evident in the bokeh area than they will on your image, on your sharpened area. So any suggestions for tree lines where there are spaces between the branches showing backlight with tiny halos? The suggestion would be to avoid them, period. That is a situation where you are going to have to avoid at all costs. And if you start creating a halo, that's the warning sign. Just say no. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to back that off, and I'm going to find another way. If you are seeing a halo, don't think about fixing it first. That's the last thing you should think about. That's why this whole thing that I did was, let's talk about fixing them last. Let's talk about avoiding them for longer than we talk about fixing them. I don't know if you noticed that, but there was 27 minutes of avoidance and 20 minutes of fixing. So you should be avoiding all day long. That should be it. Can you explain the reverse sharpen method setup? I'm going to actually have you defer and go to the live event replay page. I've already got that chaptered for you. So when you watch the live event replay, you can do that there. I don't want to go back into something that I already said. I really don't like repeating myself. So the color of the halo looks to be consistent. Could you select the color to mask it? You could, but if you do that, then every color that is in the image that has the same color as the halo is going to be selected as well, which on that lizard shot could be quite easy to fix. But on a shot of, let's say, a cityscape with a background that has a lot of blown highlights in the background with it, it's not going to work out very well. So again, avoidance. If I'm getting questions asking me about fixing halos, the first thing you should be saying to yourself is, how can I avoid that? Okay, don't ask about fixing. Ask about avoiding. Okay, that's the key thing there. How would you typically edit a photo with a backlit tree in front of a dramatic? So that's the same thing. You're going to have to just avoid it. If you see a halo, avoid it, period. Could you duplicate a low f-stop image in PS and only sharpen the foreground layer? Absolutely. You could do that. There's a ton of things that you can do. That's why I like Photoshop better than Adobe Camera Raw. Photoshop should be your workhorse. Adobe Camera Raw should be the guys that are prepping up. Let's say this. Okay, if you're in a caravan, I'm going to use a completely different analogy than a cooking analogy. You're in the, let's say, 1500s. I don't know, maybe that's even too long ago. 1800s, and you're on a covered wagon. 1800s. You're in a covered wagon. Adobe Camera Raw should be the people that are like prepping up the cart to move, and Photoshop is the horses moving the cart. Okay, so you shouldn't be spending as much time prepping to leave as you should on your journey. Photoshop is the journey. Adobe Camera Raw is the prep work. So I think I answered all the questions there. Let me look at the chat. Thanks, great webinar as usual. Let's see if there's any questions here. You can do the steps. Okay, that was already asked. Thanks, Blake, for a terrific lesson. I believe it was Matt K that suggested subtract the foreground from the sky mask. I think it was actually Brian Matias first, and then Matt Klaskowski started talking about it too, because Brian Matias called me and was like, "You never believe what I just figured out." So I think it was Brian, because Brian likes to call me and Matt, and me and Matt like to call Brian, and Brian, we all call each other. We're good friends. If you can learn to avoid it, you won't have to fix it. Exactly. That's the key factor there. If you can avoid it, avoid it. It's like, why get bit by a snake to go to the hospital to get the venom removed if you just avoid the snake to begin with? Let me come up with another analogy. No, I'm not going to. I'll leave it at that. Oryx says, what about presets? What about presets is what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to return the question. What about them? Let's see, Q&A here. Difference between darken and darker color. They're slightly different, but also very much the same. There's a course that I have in F64 Elite called Blend Modes. It explains every single blend mode from beginning to end. So I'm going to defer to F64 Elite for that one. And I'm waiting on Ulrich to tell me what he means by what about presets. And then I'll bow out because I like to answer every question before I say peace out to you guys. While I'm waiting on that one, guys, F64 Elite, I'm telling you, it's a treasure trove of stuff. Like, I do this stuff. If you saw what if you're new to this type of style of learning and you're like, man, I wish I could get more of this stuff. Every single month on F64 Elite, every month, I critique 24 images, and it's more of a problem-solving session. I take images that have problems and I solve them. If you're wondering where all of this experience comes from on how to fix halos and avoid them, it comes from teaching people how to fix their images, period. So it's like the image doctor kind of thing. So Oryx says, if you have several presets, I can guarantee that you'll get halos. Okay, then don't use them. You like that answer? Avoid! The alarms are going off. We've got a halo. What do we do? I don't know. We could run around like a crazy person asking what we should do because there's a halo. But wait, the alarm's going off. That means we need to do something. Like, period. You see a halo, avoid it. Avoid it. Avoid it. Okay? I don't know how else to say that. As usual, excellent webinar. I need to try to avoid them, but I like the enlarge fix. Yes, there are instances. I will say there are instances, but I would say out of all I haven't seen a halo in my work in ages, guys. That's why I'm telling you this stuff. You know how hard it was for me to make this live event? It was because I had to create halos, and I haven't seen one in a long time. It's because when I get to the point of a halo, I just avoid it. Okay, yeah, the best surgery is no surgery. I like that, Ulrich. Perfect. Awesome. You guys are all great. Thank you for hanging out with me on a Thursday for an hour. I really appreciate all you guys. And I'd love to see you guys come in as F64 Elite members. These coupon codes will be available until May 27th. They're on the replay page, so you have the whole weekend to think about it. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me, Blake at F64 Academy. I don't bite. Well, I do, but it's not that hard. You'll be all right. And as always, have a great weekend. If you're in America, have fun celebrating Memorial Day weekend, but just be safe and as usual. But if you need anything from me, Blake at F64 Academy. Love you guys. Have a great rest of your day, great rest of your weekend, and I'll see you on the next one.